Welcome to the Human Variable, where we learn about the complicated intertwining of science and public policy. I'm Mark DeTusa, and in this episode, I'm delighted to bring you my interview with Dr. Naomi Oreskes, a distinguished professor of the history of science at Harvard University and author of her recent book, Why Trust Science. We'll be hearing about why the knowledge science generates is trustworthy and where scientists have gone wrong, but science has prevailed, among other interesting topics. Afterwards, we'll have Maneha, Ayana, Tina, and myself discuss some of the ideas brought up during the interview and our take on them as early career scientists and students. Without further ado, let's get into the interview. I'm very excited to be talking to you today. I ended up getting this book at the AAAS conference in 2020, right before the everything shut down. And I really enjoyed, so I don't have any background in philosophy, but I really enjoyed reading and trying to understand, I guess, the sociology, not psychology, but sociology behind the why we trust science. And so I guess where I wanted to start was, how did you get interested in this topic, or even just how did you end up studying this kind of sociology as a profession?
Well, this book had a very specific origins. After Merchants of Doubt was published, I received huge numbers of invitations to speak around the country. And when I would speak, I would go to fairly good, make an effort, great pains to explain the science clearly, to explain to people what the scientific basis was for understanding climate change and what work scientists had done to bring us to our present level of understanding. And often my talks were very effective. People would thank me for explaining things that they hadn't understood before. But sometimes there would be someone in the audience who would get up and say, often in a somewhat belligerent tone of voice, well, that's all very good, but why should we trust the scientists?
Okay.
And this came up enough. It came up often enough that I started thinking, well, it's a fair question. We have this whole scientific process. All these people have done all this work, and after decades of work, they've come to these conclusions. But should we trust it? I mean, why should we trust those conclusions? So I started thinking that it was a legitimate question, and that shockingly, there actually didn't seem to be a book out there that attempted to give a straight answer to a fair question. And since this question had come up a lot in public talks that were aimed for general audiences, I set the challenge to myself: could I write a book that would answer that question in a way that anybody who had gone to college could understand? And so that was the goal of the book. And if I've done that, then I'm very pleased.
I hope so. I come from a science background, so I can't exactly speak to that. But I do find it interesting because a lot of people who end up doing science end up having some exposure to scientists and having, I guess, a positive relationship with scientists and science. And so I find it interesting to come from a perspective that's like, well, like why even trust scientists in the first place?
Right. And you have to
Um,
remember, most people don't know any scientists, and public opinion polls show that if you ask the American people to name a living scientist, most of them can't. I mean,
right.
maybe now after COVID-19, they could name Dr. Fauci,
Touchy,
but
yeah.
that would likely be it.
It's really interesting, but I mean, it makes sense. But again, like I'm such in a bubble that it's hard for me to see that, and that's why this book was really nice to read, because it helped give me a bit of an understanding of it. So yeah, I just remember learning in like elementary school or middle school or whatever, like, oh yeah, Dr. Francis Bacon and the scientific method, and that's why we should, and that's why science works, and all these different things. And I think personally, I find this a lot more compelling of an argument that sociologically that we're trusted as experts, scientists are, hopefully, and that when we come to a consensus, it's because we went through this very scientific process of talking through things. So I guess, could you give in a nutshell, I guess, a better explanation of what I just tried to do, which was like,
Sure.
what is the sociological advantages of science and scientists?
Well, the central argument of the book is that science is trustworthy because of the process that scientists use to vet claims. So many of us have been taught an image of science based on the idea of a eureka moment. Newton is sitting under a tree and an apple falls on his head and he suddenly thinks, oh my God, gravity. Well, sometimes science begins there, but that's just the start of a process. I think the more important part of it is not so much where the idea comes from, but how the idea is evaluated. And what modern science is all about is the collective vetting of claims. So if I have an idea as a scientist, That's good. That's a first step. But now I have to collect evidence to support or refute the idea. So I have to do field work or laboratory experiments or clinical trials or animal studies. But then I have to present it to my colleagues and I have to defend the claim. And my colleagues will ask tough questions. They'll say, well, is there enough evidence? Is the evidence of high quality? Does the evidence support the claim or maybe might be more consistent with a different interpretation? And that process is really rigorous. It's often not that friendly. It's often not that nice. Science can be tough because that critical vetting of claims needs to be tough. And that happens multiple times. So if I'm a scientist, I will typically take an early claim to a conference where I'll present preliminary work, I'll get feedback. Maybe people will say, you really don't have enough evidence, so I'll go back and get more data. Eventually, I get to the point where I feel I have enough evidence, I'll submit it to a journal. Then it gets reviewed again. The reviewers will say, well, we're not convinced of this. You need to explain that better. So I go back and I fix that. And then I submit it, and it goes through this critical vetting claim. Then it gets published, but even then the job's not done because now people will try to use the work. And if people can't use it, they'll say, hey, Oreskes, you published this article, but we're trying to do this and we can't replicate the claim. So there's this very multi-staged process of vetting claims. And the things that we call facts, the things that we call scientific knowledge, are things that have sort of gone through this trial by fire and emerged intact at the other end. And that's the piece that I think most people don't understand about science. It's not explained in most textbooks, but that's what I think is really the critical basis for accepting or trusting the claims. It's not because scientists are geniuses. They might be or they might not be. I mean, some are, but most aren't. It's because the claims have been through this really tough process of critical scrutiny.
It is interesting to me that is how it ends up being. That's why science is strong, is because of the community. Because really, I guess the way stories are spread is you just tend to have like this genius myth, and like you said, there are geniuses. There are geniuses in
Right.
probably every discipline.
Well, that's right. There are artistic, musical geniuses. There are business geniuses. But, we recognize that if you go, let's say, to a rock concert, I mean, they might have a genius lighting guy, but the light alone doesn't make the concert, right?
What's really interesting, and I will admit that I really want to read Merchants of Doubt, but I haven't had the chance to do so yet,
It's
is
okay.
that, oh, okay. I got a personal, my responsibility is
You're
absolved.
cleared.
So there are bad actors, essentially, people that attempt to use bad faith arguments to try to undermine facts and science. And it's really interesting because in science, at least for the most part, I mean, you can have bad actors in science as well who are interested in promoting their own ideas and for their own fame and that sort of thing. But for the most part, I've been in this scientific bubble where it really is all about like, prove the facts, prove why you think you're right. If you're wrong, it's not a reflection on you mostly. It's sometimes just a reflection of the science. But then when you get out into the political or the public realm, there are a lot of people who are interested in peddling their own ideas because it helps their self-worth or what they're trying to achieve. And so it's just an interesting, it helps like break away that naivete, essentially. I think the next question or like next line of questioning that I'm interested in exploring is what you think young scientists should try to take away from lessons that this book attempts to teach in terms of how science works and how we as young scientists can either advocate for science or, yeah, I think advocate for science is probably a good word because as usual, scientists probably are often in their own bubble, whether it's why they went into science or when they're in the ivory tower itself. That's its own bubble. So how can we as young scientists sort of adapt to a day and age when science is becoming more politicized? Well, actually, it's been politicized all the time, but we're more aware of it now, I guess is what I'm going to say,
Yeah.
because of recent events.
I think the most important lesson of the book for the current moment is the argument in the book about diversity.
Oh,
So
yeah.
So one of the things I say in the book is that if this model of science is right, that the reliability of claims depends upon the critical scrutiny of those claims, then the next question we have to ask is, okay, well, who's doing the scrutinizing? And there we have some very good evidence from history. And I tried in the book to draw on my own knowledge of the history of science to say, So how should we think about the people who are doing the scrutinizing? And one of the lessons of history of science, I think, is that we do have examples where scientists have gone wrong, where scientists have believed things that we later thought were clearly not the case. And when we look at those cases, we often see two important things. One is that we see that actually there wasn't a consensus. So if people say, oh, there was a consensus the earth was flat, or oh, there was a consensus that, whatever. Actually, no. When you look closely at those examples, you often find that there was actually pretty rigorous debate. There may have been a pretty big argument. There may have been a lot of dissent. And the people who are claiming today that science is not trustworthy because there was a consensus, for example, on eugenics. That's one real life example that I use. Actually, there wasn't a consensus on eugenics. So we can look back and view eugenics as quite noxious. We can view it as very unfortunate that otherwise intelligent people supported really erroneous and in some cases immoral policies based on eugenic arguments. But if the argument is to say we shouldn't trust science because scientists had a consensus on eugenics, that's just false. That's historically incorrect. So the first thing is that we have to understand that consensus is very important in science as a marker of agreement. When we have consensus, that tells us that scientists have agreed on this issue. When we don't have consensus, it tells us they haven't agreed and we probably need to do more work. And when there isn't a consensus, it might be legitimate to reserve judgment. And that's why in my own work on the history of climate change, early on in my work, I wrote what became a very famous paper, simply saying that there was a consensus on the reality of man-made climate change, because people need to know that. Because if there isn't a consensus, then what we do is different than if there is. If
Yes.
there isn't a consensus, it's legitimate to say, let's do more work, let's wait and see. Well, maybe it may not be legitimate to say wait and see, but it might be legitimate. But if we know it's real, we know it's happening, and we know it's doing damage, then there is absolutely no excuse for delay. So that's kind of argument number one about the importance and the significance of understanding whether there is or is not a consensus on any particular issue. The second point, though, is that if we look at some examples in the past where, let's say, many scientists thought things that we might today consider erroneous, we often find that those communities were not very diverse. Or maybe there was a consensus among a certain part of the community. So one example that I give, there's a kind of consensus among white men that women are too weak to withstand the rigors of higher education. But yeah, women didn't think that was right, and there was a very famous woman physician, Mary Putnam Jacobi, who argued against it and said, no, these data are really thin. And so in that example, it's really important that Mary Putnam Jacobi was there, because actually this famous book written by a very famous Harvard professor was really crappy methodologically. His sample
Mm.
size was very, very small. It was very biased. So there were some obvious flaws that any good scientist say looking at this could say, well, he has a sample size of like 7 people, right? And he has no independent corroboration of some of the claims. But it took a woman to say, well, hold on a second. I mean, a male colleague could have looked at this and said this sample size is ridiculously small. But for whatever reason, his male colleagues didn't do that, but his female colleague did. And so this becomes an example that then supports the argument for diversity. And so what I argue in the book is that if we're all looking at a problem in exactly the same way, then there's a strong worry that we may be missing important things. It's like the parable of the blindfolded people and the elephant, right? We're missing things. We have blind spots. But if we can look at the problem from a number of different perspectives, the odds are better that we don't miss something big. And so this means that if we have a diverse community with people with different backgrounds, different experiences, different background assumptions, there's a greater likelihood that we can see the problem in its full complexity and get the right answer. And so the most important take home, I think, from the book is that diversity in science is not just a moral imperative. I mean, it is a moral imperative. It's justice, equity. These are all really important things, but it's also an epistemic imperative. And I think a lot of scientists don't get that. I think a lot of scientists think, oh, yeah, it'd be nice if we had more women and people of color, but, the most important thing is to do good science. I'm saying if you want to do good science, you have to have women and people of color. And ideally, young and old, people from different parts of the world. I mean, it's not just about skin color and sexuality, it's about diversity of approach and attitude. Because this is the other one really important thing. One of the things we know from history and philosophy of science is that all scientists come to their work with what philosophers call pre-theoretical assumptions, things we assume to be true, but we may not necessarily question in our daily work. Those pre-theoretical assumptions are often highly conditioned by our life experiences. So if we've had different life experiences, we'll come to the table with different pre-theoretical assumptions, and then we can say, well, hold on a second, why are you assuming that? And then I can say, oh yeah, that's a good point. Why am I assuming that?
Mm-hmm. There's a section in the book, and no spoilers, not too many spoilers, because I do want people to want to check out the book. But I really enjoyed the section where you looked at these different examples of these fallacies in science and how they got pervaded. And I know you mentioned a few. Is there one in particular that you found really interesting, that you really liked to talk about or like study?
Well, they're all good in different ways. And one of the reasons I chose these different examples because they're good in different ways. But I guess my favorite one is the story of dental floss because
Yeah.
it's the most fun.
Mm-hmm.
So many people read the newspaper articles a couple of years ago saying that dental floss didn't do you any good. That was wrong. That was erroneous reporting, but it was based on something that's very common in science, and it's what I call methodological fetishism. The idea that the only kind of evidence that really counts is evidence of a particular kind, in this case, the randomized clinical trial. So what happened was a reporter who decided to look into this, looked into the issue and found that by the standard of the randomized clinical trial, the evidence for benefit of dental floss, the use of dental floss, was weak. And so he wrote this article and it got picked up by a lot of media. And there was a kind of Schadenfreude, quality to it. Oh, look at that. Ha ha ha.
I may or
I
may
never,
not have flossed a little less frequently after seeing just for a
right.
little
Or
bit.
I don't have to feel bad now to admit the truth that I don't floss regularly. So there was a lot of stuff like that, but it was wrong because randomized clinical trials are a very powerful tool and they're very good to use when you can do them. But you can't do a randomized clinical trial of dental floss because, well, I should make this clear. The classic randomized clinical trial is double blind. The person doesn't know. It's like the vaccine trials we've just had for COVID-19. So some people are given the vaccine, some people are given a blank. The people who get it don't know which one they're getting, and the doctors or nurses giving it to them don't know. Why is that? Well, because we know that there's a psychological component to healing. If people think that they're getting effective drugs, some people will get better. There's also a psychological component to side effects. If people think they're being given a powerful drug, they may begin to develop headaches or stomach aches. This is the placebo effect. So there's both positive and negative placebo effects. So in order to correct for that, in a classically designed randomized clinical trial, we don't tell the people whether they're getting the actual drug or the actual vaccine or a placebo. Well, there's no way to do that with dental floss, right? I mean, if you're flossing your teeth or you don't, right? And so you can't do that kind of a trial.
You
But
just give them candy floss, right?
there you
Isn't that?
go. There you go. That would be
Yeah.
good. But there's other kind of evidence that you can bring to bear. And when you look at the other evidence in this case, you actually find there's a lot of clinical evidence that dental flossing is protective in a number of different ways. So that journalist made a giant mistake by only focusing on one kind of evidence and ignoring many other kinds. But I use this example because it's not just journalists who do that. Scientists do it too. And I think in this case, I don't know the particular journalist, so I can't say for sure. But my guess is that he made that error because he was following scientists who make that error. Because there are many scientists who sort of glorify the randomized clinical trial. It's often referred to as the gold standard.
Right.
But gold isn't good for everything. I mean, gold is good for electronics and it's good for jewelry, but sometimes other metals are better. I mean, I wouldn't want to build, you can't build an airplane out of gold, right?
Oh
You
man.
out of some kind of lightweight titanium steel alloy, right? So it's about the right tools for the job. Or another way to think about it is, if I'm a carpenter, I'm not going to go to every job with just a hammer. I'm going to bring a hammer and nails and screwdrivers and, all kinds of other things because we need different tools for different jobs. And that's true in science as well as in carpentry.
I mean, yeah, there is that phrase where all you have a hammer, everything looks like nails. And
Exactly.
I totally get it because as a graduate student who's been schooled in a very specific type of methodology and like, oh, this is how we approach this problem, then that's how I'm going to approach problems because I'm like, okay, this works. And that kind of goes back to the whole not marketplace of viewpoints exactly, but just diversity of viewpoints in the sense that having people with different methodologies and different ways to approach a problem can help correct for that. And again, that's an argument you
Exactly.
make in the book, and I think that's very compelling. Not to get too inside baseball here or inside science, but as someone who talks about science with people who aren't scientists, or at least thinks about that, I find it really interesting to see how the media depicts science. I mean, you could go in a whole tirade on how the media sensationalizes certain things or misreports other things, but I guess one place I like to start is when I was developing another podcast and I was talking to a scientist about what he did for his work. I mentioned that for this podcast, I really found it interesting to talk about, try to humanize science, to say like, oh, that science is a process and we make mistakes. And this is how basically, I think that trying to be relatable is a good way to get to other people to understand like, oh, scientists aren't just like Einstein that are geniuses and they come up with stuff immediately. It is a process and it's work. But I remember this professor telling me like, oh, you can't give an opening like that because science deniers are going to come in and use that weakness to try to push their own narrative. My response to that was kind of like, we can't bend our will to people who are just going to always find something wrong no matter what. So I guess my first question on that, Mark, is like, and I think we're in agreement, so maybe that's why I'm asking to some degree, but how do you feel like is the best or most appropriate way for the media to depict science or scientists? What do you think would be the best way to try to humanize or get people to empathize with scientists?
Well, the most appropriate way to describe anything is always the truth. And if you tell stories about science that aren't really true, then you're opening yourself up to the risk of being unmasked. And
Mm-hmm.
so while I understand the scientist who says, oh, well, if you admit our weaknesses in public, people might use that against us. Well, that's true. There is a risk, but I think there's a greater risk that if you pretend to be perfect, then sooner or later someone will see that you're not perfect and they'll say, aha, we've unmasked you. And I think we saw that some years ago with the incident of the stolen emails from East Anglia, sometimes referred to as ClimateGate, but I don't like to use that term because that implies the scientists did something wrong and they didn't. So, but one of the things that came out in those emails was the humanity of these scientists, that they were frustrated. They were getting attacked shamelessly by unprincipled people, and it was frustrating them, and they didn't know what to do about it. And so they have a conversation, and some of the things they considered, weren't the best ideas. They didn't actually do those things. We've all had the situation we come home from, work, or our thesis advisor was annoying that day, and you say to your spouse, God, I'd like to kill my advisor. You don't really want to kill your advisor. It's just a thing you say, right? And
Yeah.
so these emails were filled with stuff like that. But they were taken out of context. They were splashed all over the news media, and they were used then to try to allege that scientists had done something wrong. And I think that that worked in part because many people had this image of scientists as being sort of, on a pedestal. And so it was kind of knocking down the gods. And there was a certain schadenfreude in that, right? Of people taking a certain pleasure of cutting down to size people who maybe they resented. Maybe they resented the fact that scientists have a somewhat elevated position in society. So I think that if you deny your vulnerability, you put yourself at risk of exposure, as opposed to if you're just honest and say, yeah, I'm a person, I make mistakes, we all do. But the really good thing about science is that actually we can admit our mistakes. We're
Mm,
supposed to admit our mistakes.
yeah.
It's part of the culture that admitting mistakes is a good thing, and therefore we can fix them. Because if we deny our mistakes, then we never have the opportunity to repair them. So again, I think if we make it clear that this is kind of a cool thing. Like, how many people do you know who are really kind of okay with admitting in public that they screwed something up? Well, often not that many people. I mean, politicians are not good at it. Businessmen are not good at it. But scientists actually do it every day. It's our job to figure out where we've gone wrong and to fix it. And I think when you tell that story to people, it's actually very compelling.
Mm,
The other thing I would say to people who are interested in science communication is that a lot of scientists think that the most important thing to do when speaking to the public is to explain the science, to be very clear about the data and the scientific claims, and also to be very careful not to overstate the claim or understate the claim. But actually we know a lot from communications, from advertising, from Hollywood, that people don't connect to each other mostly on a rational level. I mean, some people do, sometimes two scientists fall in love, it happens, right? But in general, we connect on the emotional level.
Hmm.
We feel a connection with people, as you use the word relatability, right? When we feel like we feel their humanity, and they don't have to be the same as us. I mean, think about all the people who follow Beyonce or, J-Lo on Twitter. They don't necessarily have anything in common with these superstars, but there's something about their humanity that we like, that we relate
Mhm.
to, that we feel like, like watching Lady Gaga sing at the inauguration, like what a moment that was, because we felt her humanity and you could feel her pouring her heart and soul into that song, and you felt it in your heart. And that's what makes people connect, and that's what makes people trust each other, because we tend to trust people with whom we feel some kind of emotional rapport. And so a lot of scientists totally miss that. In fact,
Yeah.
they think they're not supposed to talk about who they are as a person. They think that if they reveal their emotionality, that they'll be viewed as less credible. And I think all the evidence suggests that the opposite is true, that if you
Interesting.
actually reveal your emotionality and your vulnerability, I mean, this is the part of the book where I talk about values. If you reveal your values and you talk about, well, here's why I care about climate change, because I want my children to live in a world that is as beautiful and gives them as much opportunity to be well off and prosperous and live a good life as I had. I mean, in my experience, that's something that every mother and most fathers can relate to. And that
Yeah.
can be a place where then you can transcend some of the political divisions by realizing many of us above a certain age have children. And if there's one thing that I have experienced in my life is that I have never met a person with children who didn't care about those children.
I think another way to approach this is we again talked about diversity. And as scientists, it's one thing to say that we like diversity, not only from a moral standpoint, but also from a, building science standpoint. But how can we, again, relatability, approachability, how can we walk the walk? How can we help science attract people that with all from all walks of life? Because look, you can't see me, this is a podcast, but it's
Mhm.
very obvious I'm this white male dude who's in physics, and my father's actually a white male dude who's in physics. I can only do
Right.
so much. And so I'm curious what you think we as scientists can try to do to help build science up as an institution for all.
Well, I think for a long time, many people viewed the work of diversifying science as the work of women and people of color, that it was kind of our responsibility to fight for women in science or to fight for people of color. And so I think the single most important thing that all people can do is to say, this is not just the work of women and people of color, this is the work of all scientists, and that we all need to do what we can to make science welcoming to a diversity of people, to make all of our students and graduate students feel valued, and that can include people with disabilities as well, or different gender situations, whatever the right word is, because it makes our science better. And so I think there are a lot of male scientists who have for a long time have felt like it really wasn't their problem. It wasn't their job. I mean, maybe they would try not to be horrible. I mean, I know lots of scientists who are perfectly good people and who, as far as I know, have never harassed anyone, but have never actively done any work to try to make science more welcoming. But if those scientists understood that our science would be better, right? If they really took that on board and said, don't you want our science to be better? And if you do, then it's really important that we work to make it more diverse. That I think is an argument that I hope, this is kind of my
Would
hope. My hope
resonate.
is that would resonate, and that we would come to a time in the future where everyone would see the work of inclusivity as being the work of all of us.
It's a pretty strong message, and I agree. I think more and more we realize, like, as somebody who wouldn't technically be diverse, even then there are things that you can do to help and to promote and to
Right.
to amplify voices that are. And I think
Right. And it's not just about skin color too. I mean, it's about, making sure that your school is assertively recruiting people from public universities,
mhm.
or people who have come from underfunded state universities, that there's all kinds of ways in which, I mean, one mistake I think we've made in recent decades is to interpret diversity a little bit too narrowly. There are
Hmm.
obviously incredibly important issues in American culture that have to do with race and sex, but there are also really important issues that have to do with class and geographic diversity. I mean, I teach at Harvard. We don't get a lot of applicants from Oklahoma or Idaho,
Mm.
um, and we should, right? Because there
Yeah.
are smart, talented people all across this country. And I think particularly private universities could do more to think about how to encourage and recruit people coming out of public universities where they may not have had the same opportunities to prepare, but where there's a lot of talent. talent that we would like to nurture.
I mean, as somebody who's wearing a Louisiana shirt right now, drinking from an LSU cup,
Excellent.
an LSU degree holder, I absolutely agree. I mean, my parents are from the Northeast, so it almost doesn't count, but I was basically born and raised in Baton Rouge. So I agree. I think that geographic and other types of diversity are as important or worth thinking about too. It's important not to be narrow in that idea. Oh, I was just going to say if there was any other sort of topics or ideas that you wanted to say for just to promote the book, we can talk about that. Otherwise, that's kind of covered.
No, I think we've hit on the main things. The only thing I would say to promote it is that the paperback edition comes out in April, and it will be very affordable, and it will have a nice, bright new green cover. So I hope that, and in terms of the spoiler alert issues, I really see this book as the critical thing is not so much the argument, which we've summarized here today, and anyone who's listened to this last half hour, 40 minutes, now knows what the argument in the book is. But I think the strength of the book really is in the evidence that I bring to bear, the specific examples that show how this works. So I'm not just telling you, but I'm showing you. And I think that's what makes the book work, in my opinion. I hope it is. And so that would be a reason why someone would want to read it, even if they've enjoyed this, or especially if they've enjoyed this podcast.
Well, I heartily recommend it. I as someone who came in more or less kind of agreeing already, I mean, that's one thing, but I at least helped put into clarity some ideas, and I thought were really well put together. So I highly recommend it. And thank you so much, Dr. Oreskes, for taking time out of your busy day to talk to us.
You're welcome. It's been a pleasure, and good luck with your studies.
Now, let's see what Maneha, Tina, and Ayana have to say about what we just heard during the interview with Dr. Oreskes. So, my first question to you guys is, with your experience in science, do you feel that what Dr. Oreskes claims about the scientific process and the scientific community, that it rings true to you? I personally agree with the fact that the science community should act in the ways that she says, but like in practice, do you feel like that is done from your experience?
So basically the claim that I heard her make was that peer review is what makes science rigorous, not necessarily the methodology. And the fact that experiments can be, like, the data can be judged by a group of other people, and then the experiments can be attempted to be replicated. And in that process, science is validated into fact. I think that's definitely the plan. That's what we try to do. I don't think it always actually ends up happening that way. I think bad science can, like, accumulate consensus through a lot of, like, sociological mechanisms, like, well, we trust that guy. He's famous. I'm not brave enough to say that he's wrong, so we're just going to go with it. And sometimes those things have very bad consequences. So I do agree that that's how things are supposed to go, but I think being humans who are subject to bias, it doesn't always go that way all the time.
Yeah, I would say that my experience, again, I have to harken back to the book Decolonizing Methodologies, which I think really changed the way I see science, like on an integral, like I can't even explain how before, like, we think science is this objective sort of truth that we think objectivity is even possible. But I realize now that like ethos of like discovering the singular truth and that cannot be denied, that can be dangerous, and it has been proven to be dangerous. And it's an imperial sort of construct, you know what I mean? It's like a colonial thing, like the fact that, you know, lived experiences aren't really trusted, you know, you can't trust a single anecdote or, you know, like old wives' tales, just like it feels like it cuts out a lot of the non-Western world. That's just what I've seen in my experience of science, that the way science is, it's very, like, you know, we're just observing, you know, we have to always have like a divide between you and then like your subject, which like makes sense. You don't want to like interfere, you know, cause other variables to come in. But then where's like that humanity? Where's the empathy? Then that means when you're observing like humans, when you're observing people from other cultures, they're just like your subjects. So I think that can get a little bit dangerous. And I wish that science wasn't like so strict and that there wasn't so much hierarchy in it. Even in this peer review structure, like the hierarchy is very, very, entrenched, which I think it should be more about community, like community science is what I more align with.
Yeah, I would have to say I agree. I agree with that because if you think about, how peer review works, and really the people who are working on, science is divided up, I guess, like into like very, very like niche little subjects a lot of the time. And so, your collaborators and people who you're working with, it could be like a set of like 3 to 5 people who are just talking, right? And the barrier to entry into that is really, really high. So, I mean, you can publish a paper and people can have opinions about it, but whether they come to you and discuss that is, and whether you're going to listen to them, and as the top person in your field, whether that's going to make an impact on you, that's not always the case. So, I mean, like the communities are really small with like high barriers to entry, which is a problem that I see.
And I feel like all of this isn't to say that science isn't real and can't be trusted. I think just as scientists in the space, we can see the holes very clearly. And so when asked, we're going to point out the holes before we point out the rigor.
Yeah, no, I during the interview, I used an anecdote where I talked to a professor and they didn't want to show those holes in science. And I think it's important as scientists to, I mean, yeah, obviously, if you show weakness, people are going to take advantage of it. But as Dr. Oreskes kind of said in her interview, she feels like putting up a false front can also come back to bite you. So I think it's important that we talk about what we think is missing. Maneha, could you give I'm sorry to put you on the spot. Could you give a more broad or a definition of what community science is and how it's not achieved but done, I guess?
Building off of what Ayana said about like the barriers, there's sort of like this far unreachability that I feel like a lot of people feel towards science, and especially towards like research and like academic level science, that it's like it can be very elitist, and only a certain privileged group of people sometimes have like access to even get into that sphere, which again adds on to the point that was made in the interview that you have just like this single demographic that is operating in that sphere that's supposed to be discovering things for everyone, which doesn't make a lot of sense. Versus like community science, I think of like recently when I did research for environmental justice, the fact that they have the entire community sort of like going out into their own like backyards, doing their own samples, like in order to see how much like lead and how much like toxic waste there is like in the air or in the ground, but not even like that level of science, but like different ways you can get involved with community science. Like you can do cool data analysis and participate in like studies that you're interested in that are in your community, even if you're not like, you don't have to actually be in academia. Like there's this one website I know of that's called like Zoo. I'll give you the link to it later. It's called Zoo something, but like it's a cool way. I go on it when I'm bored, and I can like analyze different people's like data sets, like when they're looking for like animals and they need to like identify what animals in the picture. I'll like scroll through a bunch of pictures and then it gets me to help out the Chicago area, and their wildlife scene, or like old historical documents, transcribing them, just a way for like the community to get involved in academia without, you don't have to have a bajillion degrees to do that. And to, because the principles of science, like Christina, you were saying, are still like, they hold true, and like, to discover and to learn and to question, that shouldn't be barred from anyone. Everyone should be able to do that.
Thank you, Maneha. That was a really, I think that was a really good explanation. Thinking back to something that I related to community science, but also related to what Ayana said, in that I agree that barriers to entry into science that ruin or that can degrade the quality of the science that we do. But there is a reason in some ways to have some barriers. For example, you can't really, as far as I know, I don't feel like you can do community science with like accelerator physics. Like that would be, I mean, maybe you could. I'm not entirely sure how one could do it. But as far as I know, there are certain like disciplines that I think common knowledge doesn't necessarily apply as easily. And there are reasons to have barriers to teach people up in order to be able to do and interpret the experiments well. But I think that scientists in general, even in things like particle physics, people should be able to be, or should be thinking very often about how we can make this science more accessible, not only to allow people to participate and to be a part of it and contribute their knowledge and bias to it, to make it more well-rounded, but I think also just to allow people to understand it as well. I think that those are two sides of the same coin.
I think there's a need for thinking creatively about implementing community science, because scientists are very used to thinking about their project in their way, in this like very linear, like this is how it's always been, this is how it's always will be type thinking. And I think that, like, the example of physics is frequently brought up as like a thing that we can't integrate people into. And this is just like a pet opinion of mine. I think physics is actually a great place to integrate people into, because it's like pop science, right? It's the kind of science people are almost always most excited to hear about. So like, sure, you couldn't just, grab an 8-year-old off the street and have him run the particle accelerator. That doesn't work. You do need like trained professionals to do like the detail-oriented work, but that's the case for all types of science. You can also incorporate like more community science in different ways, like with how the questions are asked or how the data is reported, or like, all sorts of other, like, think outside the boundaries of just like collecting the data and processing the data. Yeah, I just, I wanted to make a plug for like, think creatively. There are opportunities in places that we don't usually think about.
No, that's great, Tina. I hadn't considered that, and I think that's really cool.
I think you also have to consider accessibility as like that's one of, I think, the tenets that community science is trying to further. And this is, I guess, a little bit tangential, not really to just this specific topic, but when I think about peer review and just like journals and academic literature, how inaccessible that is to communities, to the public, like specifically, like, it will get published like the more inaccessible it is. Do you know what I mean? Like with the jargon, with, how specific your topic is, and then you get published in a journal and turns out it's not even like, you have to buy that journal for like $1 bajillion, whatever. You have to subscribe, and then your general public can't even read it. So then what are you doing? Who are you doing that science for? You know what I mean? Are you doing it just for that journal? I feel like you should be trying to do it for the community. Like, if it's so inaccessible, what's the point of the science? I guess that's just my personal opinion, because I understand there's some like really intense topics like in physics and stuff that like would seem like, oh, how would this benefit the community? But like science in itself, access to knowledge at like a broader level does benefit the community. Like it doesn't matter like what the topic is.
To take that idea and make it a little bit more tangible, like those journals are not only not accessible to the general public, so like Pete and Sharon can't read your paper, but like also neither can most of your lawmakers or the staffers in their office or the people who decide what projects are going to be funded next and which field is advancing most quickly, so we need to prioritize grants in that area. If they can't read those super jargony and accessible papers because they're behind a paywall or because they're written in a language that isn't clear, you're also doing science a big disservice. And I'm not saying that means that we need to like write papers for journals in a way that's simpler. Like, sure, leave those papers as complicated as they are, because those are the words that scientists use to communicate with each other. But there probably should be a second level of communication that's open to the public, open to like public officials, that's more clearly written, more briefly written, and not behind a paywall, right? There are opportunities beyond the standard structure of science that we could take advantage of.
But let's not go as far as eliminating the job that I want to do, which is communicating science to policymakers. Let's make sure there's a middleman so I can have that job.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we do need to, maybe the solution is to create more middlemen like that. Maybe the solution is to like make science communication like a much more mainstream like career path, like how we have like nurse practitioners serving as like the intermediaries between doctors and general nurses, like people with some level of expertise, but not like the training and level of like time commitment that like having MD requires. Like maybe we need the science version of those.
And I think that does exist. It's just I know it's not as popular, not as in the public eye, I think, at least at the moment.
I mean, I know like a lot of science communication, jobs like that are freelance, which can dissuade a lot of people from doing it. If that kind of job was more secure and had like a much more, I guess, like traditional job label framework, whatever you want to call it, like it could be a little bit easier to get that out for the public.
Yeah, I think a lot of like the the projects that happen in spaces like science communication or diversity and inclusion are seen by the scientific community as distractions or like a lack of commitment to your research. And then it ends up like, if you choose to do these things, it actually ends up undermining your career progression because you're seen as being less committed to the research because you're spending time doing these things that don't matter. Making science communication, diversity and inclusion, etc. kind of type work into real scientific work that's considered a part of the science ecosystem, it's, I would think, a good way to kind of formalize and like write these roles into the structure that is our field.
Any other thoughts on the interview or any of the topics that we discussed?
What I think is interesting, I guess in my experience, when I tell people about my interest in science and policy, I'm shocked by how confused people are. And I'm scared by how confused people are and like how many people don't really value science communication or like understand it even. At least in my experience, when I say the word science communication, people just, they don't understand like what the purpose is, what the point is, why do you have to communicate science? Like it should, like it's just, it doesn't, you have to go through a lot of explaining, which I think just, yeah, is like what Ayana, what you were talking about, how if these job paths were this, if science communication was just more validated as a field and as something that's important and that we need like now more than ever, I think, then those jobs and people trying to do that work would also be more validated.
I also wanted to respond at some point in the interview, the topic of like, the reason why we have peer review is because like not everyone like is going to be a super genius and like figure it all out by themselves. But I also want to throw out there that like, while geniuses do exist and make contributions to science, they also aren't infallible. Like even the people who are super duper experts in the field like will have a shortness of vision and a shortness of perspective due to just their humanity. Like it's not a character flaw. It's just like the fact that no one can know everything, right? So putting this like extra weight on the opinions of experts and geniuses in the field kind of does us a disservice because it allows us to overlook blind spots. So that was like a thought I had that I wrote down in my notes.
There's a balance in that, like experts are kind of a shortcut sometimes in that their opinion should get more weight hypothetically because they know well. But that shouldn't be substituted as the opinion that everyone follows. And that's the balance that's hard to follow, I think.
I think it like depends on like the state of things. Like since we don't have enough science communication, we have to rely so heavily on experts a lot of the time, right? Like if in a situation we're in now, a lot of people don't want to say, oh, like the virus isn't real, and they don't want to listen to Dr. Fauci or something like that, versus like if people knew what was really happening, things might be different. So like I do see that there's it depends. The situation could be alleviated if there was better science communication all around, right?
I was also thinking about the issue of like consensus, right? Because I feel like that can be a double-edged sword when you think about it like in depth, because when we were talking about the homosexuality episode, there was a lack of consensus in like the American Psychological Association, wherein half the group disagreed with what the voted consensus came to, that homosexuality was not a mental disorder. Half of the group was like, no, it definitely is. But then when you flip that again and look at situations like the example that Dr. Oreskes gave, where they were saying that women weren't capable of doing science because we had this like little teeny tiny study, and all the female scientists were like, that doesn't make sense, and their dissent was also dismissed. So then you have to ask yourself, how do we know when it's appropriate to dismiss the dissent, and how do we make those calls? And I think that's something that like I don't have an answer to, but we should think about, because like including diverse voices means incorporating more dissent, which means we have to have a mechanism to incorporate that dissent into the consensus we ultimately give and decide what perspectives are valid versus not valid in a way that's fair.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And I think obviously there's no clear-cut answer. In 1973, when they voted for homosexuality not being in the DSM, I think that if you had a diverse crowd, that you'd more likely get what we would consider to be the correct decision at the time. And I think that is maybe one step towards trying to bridge this conundrum that you're talking about. That, you know, if we had a more representative population of people making this decision and contributing their thoughts, that hopefully we would approximate the truth better. But I don't know. That might not be the case. That I hope so.
It probably would if people have the same goal. That's always the issue. It's like if people have different goals, then they'll promote something different. If they have the same goal, then, you know, the knowledge of crowds will help you.
That's a really good point. Hey listeners, thanks for sticking around to the end of the discussion. Double thanks goes to Dr. Naomi Oreskes for agreeing to interview, and also for my discussants Maneha Rao, Christina Roman, and Ayana Matthews. Funding for The Human Variable was provided by Research America. That's Research America, who are dedicated to elevating the importance of scientific research, innovation, and public health in the national conversation. The host of this episode was Jeffrey Dewey. That's it from The Human Variable. Until next time, be a part of the solution.